If you do not have a regular navy, you have a chance to defeat your opponent's naval power with land attacks. The Ukrainian army presents the best example of this by launching attacks on Ukrainian port cities occupied by Russia with ground attacks. The Ukrainian armed forces are gripping Russia's naval forces in the Sea of Azov and the Crimean Black Sea areas. Russia currently has 22 warships in the Black Sea. 15 of these ships are surface combatants, and most of the rest are amphibious ships. These Russian ships, as well as Russian submarine forces whose route is unknown, occasionally maneuver into the coastal areas of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian army does not want to allow the Russians to expand their offensive axis using their navy. For this, Ukrainians are targeting critical front lines such as Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol. Russian forces were on alert in Mariupol and Berdyansk ports where the Ukrainian forces had been carrying out intense missile attacks for a week. Russian forces were helpless against Ukrainian missile and artillery attacks and could not prevent them. These ports have long been used as the main supply line for the Russian army with a sharp move. The Russian Navy withdrew 14 warships and more than 40 Russian cargo and civilian ships from the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol. Ukraine struck fear into the heart of the Russian Navy, disrupted the Russian main supply lines, and prompted the withdrawal of the Russian Navy. With this move, Ukraine hit 3 birds with 1 stone. So how did the chain of attacks that forced the Russian Navy to withdraw 54 ships with the greatest humiliation in history develop? And how were the Russian generals helpless? Let's dive into the legendary Ukrainian offensive on the southern port fronts. There were reports that Russian ships had entered the port of Berdyansk and Mariupol. One of the videos posted on social media networks captured a cluster of Russian military equipment guarded by Pantsers 1 Sam at dock number 10. From the moment of this rupture, the Ukrainian armed forces and artillery units began to use an unbelievable war tactic. Ukrainian forces have begun to target Russian-occupied Ukrainian port cities and areas close to the sea on the southern front lines, putting the Russian Navy under ground attack. The first target of the Ukrainian army was the port city of Berdyansk and Mariupol. Here, a large number of Russian naval forces controlled the seaside of the city, but the Ukrainians launched a sudden missile and artillery attack on a very critical area close to the port of Berdyansk. At least 8 explosions occurred in the occupied Berdyansk region of the Zaporizhzhia region in recent days. Explosions were mostly occurring at Russian bases and arsenals in the airport and port area of Mariupol and Berdyansk. The explosions, which took the port under their influence, mobilized the Russians. Russian troops began to receive security equipment against possible different attacks. Telegram channels reported that Russian Navy ships and freighters escaped from the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol after these explosions. According to local sources, Ukrainian forces allegedly used Storm Shadow missiles in their attacks targeting Berdyansk and Mariupol. Russian Navy warships, civilian ships, and cargo ships were located in these 2 critical ports. Currently, there are 8 Russian warships on the Crimea and Azov coasts. It is seen that 14 Russian warships and 40 Russian cargo and civilian ships have been withdrawn from Mariupol, Crimea, and Berdyansk ports. Currently, the Ukrainians have repeatedly targeted the port city of Berdyansk and Mariupol in the last week. For this reason, the Russians do not want to anchor their navy forces in this port permanently or for a long time. In fact, the concerns of the Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the top Russian generals carrying out the invasion are quite justified because the Ukrainians expanded the attack area much more in order to expel the Russian Navy forces from port cities such as Berdyansk. Already signs that the Ukrainian army would blockade Berdyansk and drive Russian Navy forces out of this area were evident from a critical attack only 24 hours before the 8 explosions in Berdyansk. If you remember, the Ukrainians attacked the city of Pryazovia, which is located near the city, before targeting Berdyansk with 8 artillery attacks in order to distance the Russian Navy forces from the Black Sea, where southern Ukraine and Crimea are located. Ukrainian forces launched a massive missile attack on objects critical to Russian troops in the occupied territory of Pryazovia. While the Russian naval forces suffered shock after shock, the Ukrainians were constantly attacking more heavily to drive Putin's ships completely out of the Berdyansk vicinity. Berdyansk seaport, which the Russian force uses as a logistics center for the delivery of ammunition and other military property by sea, and the coastal city of Pryazovia, located near this port, were very strategic points to take a step against the Russian Navy forces. According to the video released by local sources, it was revealed that the missiles fired by the Ukrainian forces penetrated the Russian air defense and reached the port. According to the information received from the local people at the moment, while the ambulance were on their way to the port, some Russian ships anchored near Berdyansk and Pryazovia were already leaving the port. This was not the first case of Russian rocket attacks on infrastructure objects. If you remember, before the last attacks in Berdyansk and Pryazovia, a series of explosions were heard on the outskirts of Berdyansk, accompanying the operation of the Russian air defense systems. Russian state agencies RIA Novosti and TASS, citing Ukrainian officials, reported that the Ukrainian armed forces carried out these attacks on Berdyansk before the anti-aircraft defense system was fired. According to preliminary information, the attack was carried out on rest centers in the village of Novopetrovka, near Berdyansk, where Russian forces are stationed. The recreation centers of Khimik and Vesna, located on the coast of the Sea of Azov, were hit on the same day. Powerful explosions were heard on the territory of the Azov cable plant in occupied Berdyansk. A column of smoke rose into the sky where the attacks had taken place. Russian military warehouses, allegedly located on the territory of the power plant, were attacked. After all these attacks in and around the city of Berdyansk, it turned out that many Russian Navy ships and surface combatants fled to safer areas rather than Berdyansk. The escape of the Russian Navy did not stop the Ukrainians. On the contrary, the Ukrainian forces, in addition to expelling the Russian naval forces in Berdyansk, also carried out ground attacks over Melitopol and managed to hijack the Russian ships in the areas close to the sea strip of the city. A series of loud explosions occurred in the occupied Melitopol area of the Zaporizhia region. Dense smoke was visible in the north of the city. This critical news was announced personally by Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov after the president. Also, residents of Melitopol reported more than 5 loud explosions which were well heard in the northern part of the city. After these striking attacks, Russian naval forces in the critical areas of the Sea of Azov and Melitopol began to flee towards the much safer ports of the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea. Because nowadays, 9 Russian warships, including 2 missile carriers with a total of 6 Caliber-type cruise missiles, were on combat duty in the Black Sea. 7 Russian warships have been spotted in the Mediterranean, including a missile carrier with up to 4 Caliber-type cruise missiles on board. So for Russian ships escaping from the Ukrainian coast, such areas and ports were much safer to anchor. Even the Russians no longer trusted the maritime areas. They claimed to be safe off the Black Sea and Crimea. The reason for this was, of course, the drone attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces, because the Ukrainians were almost constantly besieging the peninsula with drones. For this reason, the Russians consider that even the controlled ports in Crimea pose a risk to their navy. Ukrainian officials also make critical assessments on this issue. Ukraine's Deputy Chief of Military Intelligence, Major General Vadim Skibitsky, stated that Russia has shifted most of its Black Sea Fleet warships from its main base in Crimea to safer waters on Russian soil. In an interview with a Kiev TV channel, Skibitsky reported that the Kremlin decided to relocate the ships for fear of missile and drone attacks. The official primary headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet is located in Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea, and the site of numerous drone strikes in recent weeks. While Ukraine has not admitted responsibility for the drone strikes, Kremlin-appointed Sevastopol Governor Mikhail Roswellasheyev stated that Kiev was behind the attacks, which reportedly caused a massive fire at an oil depot in the region last Saturday. While there were so many risky factors for Moscow, the relocation of the Russian Navy was, of course, inevitable. Russia's Naval High Command reinstated most of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to the Russian city of Novorossiysk. The main base and other Russian military installations in Sevastopol were currently heavily guarded. The Russians were equipping their positions to guard against attacks on this infrastructure. However, Moscow, who could not take the risks, had to carry out this relocation practice in order not to lose its navy forces. Currently, it was not the first time that the Russians had smuggled their navy from the Sevastopol home base to Novorossiysk in the future if the attacks of the Ukrainian forces continue to be successful in this way. We may even see Moscow's navy forces landing on the Russian mainland. The large-scale offensive operation of the Ukrainian army continues from 5 different front lines already. Former British Army intelligence officer Philip Ingram had reported that the first phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive had begun a few weeks ago. The Ukrainians continue active offensive operations in the Luhansk, Bakhmut, Solder, Volodar, Zaporizhia, Melitopol, Tokmak, Mariupol, and Berdyansk directions. The first direction of the large-scale attacks of the Ukrainian army on 5 different fronts is Donetsk. Russia's defense ministry reported that Ukraine thwarted a major offensive in Donetsk in the final sign that a wider counteroffensive may have begun. The Ukrainian Air Force launched 17 attacks on the concentration of Russian troops on the Donetsk front line, and 4 more attacks on enemy air defense systems. A Russian Su-25 attack aircraft and 4 reconnaissance aircraft were also destroyed. In addition, the Ukrainian army launched a large-scale offensive on the Donetsk front line using 6 mechanized and 2 tank battalions. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Ukraine has deployed 6 mechanized and 2 tank battalions from the 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades into battle. As the sun rose over Ukraine, Russian pro-war telegram channels commonly known as Mil bloggers began to present a less rosy picture of Russia's defense in the region. Alexander Khodakovsky, who served as the battalion commander and officer in Russia's proxy presence in Donetsk Oblast, reported that Ukrainian forces also carried out effective attacks near the town of Volodar in the southwest of Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian forces continued to trap the Russians in the corridor from the central city of Donetsk to Volodar after the Ukrainian attacks reported by Alexander Khodakovsky. The general situation in Volodar began to change in favor of Kiev when the Ukrainians seized the advantage in the region. They continued to pile up their reinforcements in these areas. Ukrainian ground forces commander Oleksandr Kursky reported that troops were advancing towards Bakhmut and destroyed a Russian position near the city. The head of the pro-Moscow Vostok battalion, Alexander Khodakovsky, told Telegram that in the Novodonetsk settlement located between Volodar and Velikaya Novoselivka, Ukrainian troops achieved tangible losses and achieved tactical success. After these striking offensive operations, the second offensive axis of the Ukrainians was the Luhansk front line. Russian authorities have reported shelling attacks on the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine. It was noted that Ukraine used HIMARS rockets supplied by the USA in these attacks. In addition, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that Ukrainian planes hit 2 industrial areas in the Russian-controlled city of Luhansk in eastern Ukraine, with Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. On the same day as these attacks, smoke was seen rising above an old aviation school used by the Russian army in the east of Luhansk. Moscow-based local officials said Kiev carried out the attack with 2 Storm Shadow long-range missiles supplied by the British. It turned out that an administrative building was damaged. This striking attack followed a similar attack in Luhansk that destroyed a high-rise building and slightly injured a Russian lawmaker. Russian state media cited parts it said came from Storm Shadow rockets. After these striking attacks, another explosion occurred in the city center. The explosion occurred in a crowded barber shop. Major General Igor Kornet, Minister of the Interior of the Luhansk People's Republic, was apparently seriously injured while sitting in the barber's chair as a result of the attack. 1 person was killed and 5 others were injured. Effectively controlled by Russia. Since 2014, Luhansk has been in a relatively peaceful state since President Putin's large-scale invasion last year. But the Luhansk front line now means that the Ukrainians are suddenly vulnerable with the provision of Storm Shadow missiles with a range of over 250 kilometers, with Russian bases and weapons depots positioned far from the conflict. The Ukrainian military did not immediately comment on Russia's claim for attacks on the Luhansk front line and rarely publicly claimed responsibility for such attacks. These offensive operations in Luhansk would actually allow the Ukrainians to hit the Russian troops and resupply the depots far behind the front lines in preparation for a major counteroffensive. In other words, although the Ukrainians do not take responsibility for these attacks, the gains in Luhansk are beneficial to them. If we move to the third axis of the offensive operation on 5 different front lines after Luhansk, we will have to go to surprises. Explosions occurred in 2 occupied areas of Zaporizhia. Here we witnessed that Rylianussi is building effective defensive fortifications. The HIMARS and Storm Shadow missile attacks of the Ukrainian forces also affected Zaporizhia. After Zaporizhia, the 4th offensive axis of the Ukrainians was the city of Melitopol. Residents of the village of Mern in the Mariupol region reported a powerful explosion near a military unit captured by Russian forces. The Russians tried to deploy high-precision air defense systems. Already the Ukrainian armed forces had carried out an effective missile and artillery attack on a Russian military base in this city. A few days after this attack, the Russians began to worry as the tension in the city escalated again. Mariupol is of vital importance for the Crimean Peninsula, which is the key to the great liberation plans of the Ukrainian armed forces. Based on this plan, it is quite easy to guess that the place where the last offensive axis of the Ukrainian armed forces is located is the city of Tokmak. The city of Tokmak is in the south of Ukraine. Also, this city is seen as part of the Ukrainian corridor of ground attack to retake the Crimean Peninsula. For this reason, the Ukrainians are conducting serious offensive operations in this city as well. In recent days, Tokmak residents have reported at least 6 explosions. It was reported that a Russian ammunition depot was destroyed as a result of these attacks. Russian occupation authorities in Zaporizhia Oblast, on the other hand, began to move local collaborators and training workers deep into the occupied territory from Tokmak to Berdyansk. But we know that the violent attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces, both in Berdyansk and in the city of Mariupol, continue. In fact, the cities of Berdyansk and Mariupol are among the operational plans in the city of Tokmak, which is seen as the 5th offensive axis of the Ukrainians. The city of Berdyansk in Zaporizhia Oblast is located on the coast of the Sea of Azov, about 100 kilometers southeast of Tokmak. The city of Mariupol is on the Azov coast and has an important port. In summary, the Ukrainians are trying to achieve the great liberation by conducting effective operations on both the eastern and southern front lines. Vladimir Putin is withdrawing his troops from Ukrainian territory. A red alert has been issued in the Kremlin palace after the pro-Ukrainian Russian Freedom Legion soldiers captured the Russian city of Belgorod by order of Vladimir Putin. 25,000 Russian troops are withdrawing from Ukrainian territory. In the past days, pro-Ukrainian soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion managed to infiltrate into Russia and captured 3 different towns in the city of Belgorod on the Russian border with Ukraine. The war that has been going on for 16 months in Ukraine has now officially spread to Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has decided to withdraw nearly 25,000 Russian troops from Ukrainian territory to ensure the security of the city of Belgorod. Before getting into the details of the news, let's give a brief information about the operation that led to Putin's decision to withdraw soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion who have been fighting against Russian forces and the Russian border city of Ukraine for a long time. Neutralized Russian soldiers in a town in Kharkov. Ukrainian soldiers who captured Russian soldiers in the Ch region of Kharkov managed to infiltrate the Russian borders with an interesting strategy. Wearing the uniforms of the soldiers they captured, Ukrainian soldiers moved smoothly to the city of Belgorod on the Russian border. Ukrainian soldiers who organized separate operations in 3 different towns in Belgorod managed to push back the Russian forces there. The Belgorod regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, declared a state of emergency in the region and requested military support, stating that the situation has gotten very bad and Ukrainian soldiers continue to advance. Gladkov announced that they have started evacuating civilians. Russian troops stationed in the city of Belgorod were unable to stop the advance of pro-Ukrainian troops. Thus, on the orders of Vladimir Putin, it was planned to withdraw Russian troops from Kharkov to Belgorod. Acting on Putin's order, Russian General Valery Gerasimov withdrew nearly 25,000 Russian troops from the city of Kharkov. The hot clashes that have been going on in the Russian city of Belgorod for several days have been closely followed by the Kremlin palace. The Ukrainian army has not only deployed troops here, but also military equipment such as helicopters and unmanned combat drones. The Russian army's loss of control here poses a major threat to Putin. The statements made by the commander of the pro-Ukrainian Russian Free Legion, which managed to capture the region, have caused Putin to be even more afraid. In his statement, the Ukrainian commanders stated that they have taken action to end the Putin regime and to regain Russia's freedom, and that they will continue to advance on Russian territory. Following the Ukrainian commander's statement, General Valery Gerasimov begun moving Russian troops from Belgorod to towns near the city center. However, these troops were not enough. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army continued its operations against the occupying Russian troops in the city of Kharkov. The Ukrainian army's deployment of troops in Belgorod caused the Russian troops in Kharkiv to be squeezed. Thus, Putin decided to withdraw nearly 25,000 Russian troops from Kharkiv. The withdrawal of the Russian forces in Kharkiv, which had been under the control of the Russian army for a long time, was an unmissable opportunity for the Ukrainian army. However, the real reason for the withdrawal of these troops was to push back the Ukrainian troops stationed in Belgorod. General Gerasimov was willing to sacrifice the city of Kharkiv to save Belgorod. Now, more than 25,000 Russian troops are joining the Russian troops stationed in Belgorod. These troops are expected to soon launch an offensive against Ukrainian towns captured by the Ukrainian army. Even if the Ukrainian army withdraws from Belgorod, most of Kharkiv, which has been under Russian occupation for months, is now under Ukrainian control. Thus, the Ukrainian army was able to profit from this operation in every way. The Russian people are very afraid by the sudden spread of the war to Russia's borders. Fear and panic have gripped the citizens living in the Russian city of Belgorod, the border region of Russia and Ukraine. The successive operations of the Ukrainian army against the Russian forces have further frightened the Russian citizens in Belgorod. Russian troops occupying Ukrainian territory had to retreat to the city of Belgorod when they lost these fronts. And the Russian people who saw the Russian troops retreating here became even more worried with the withdrawal of the Russian troops. Citizens who think that the war will spread to the borders of Russia are now in a panic. But it seems that this is not the only reason. According to the statements of investigative journalists who went to the city of Belgorod with the withdrawal of Russian troops, there is great unrest in Belgorod. Vladimir Putin's soldiers are roaming the streets of Belgorod, and more Russian troops are arriving in Belgorod every day. Many Ukrainian citizens have also flocked to Belgorod because of the war. The locals in Belgorod are very disturbed by the influx of Ukrainians and the constant power outages in the city at the moment. Education in Belgorod, near the border with Ukraine, has completely stopped. Schools in areas close to the border have been temporarily closed. With the increase in the number of Russian soldiers in the city of Belgorod, there is no lack of fights and noise. Russian soldiers are currently not on any mission, and locals are disturbed by the fact that these soldiers are constantly drinking alcohol and fighting among themselves. While the situation in Belgorod is like this, the promise made by Russian President Vladimir Putin has lost its effect after invading Ukrainian territory. Putin said that he would allow Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories to come to the city of Belgorod and enter the borders of Russia, and that these people would be given a certain amount of money. After Putin's words, many Ukrainian citizens who did not want to be caught in the middle of the war flocked to the city of Belgorod. But Putin decided to close the Belgorod border gates due to the unrest in Belgorod and the large number of refugees. The Russian army has stopped the entry to the city. Ukrainian citizens queuing for kilometers at the Belgorod border crossing do not yet know what to do. While Putin continues to deceive people by not keeping his promises to these people, he has made homeless. Since the beginning of the war, Putin has been sending Russian officials to the occupied regions of Ukraine to issue Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens. Putin's main goal is to hold an official referendum in the future to make the annexation of these cities accepted by the whole world. Currently, Putin has annexed Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk and Kherson, regions of Ukraine. However, this annexation decision is not recognized by almost any country. For this reason, Putin plans to organize an official referendum in these regions at a later date. What Putin needs for this plan is more Russian citizens. The Russian leader is sending Russian citizens to these annexed regions every month. Russian citizens agree to live in these occupied territories in exchange for promises such as regular monthly salaries, land and houses. While Putin is reducing the number of Ukrainian citizens here, he is increasing the number of Russian citizens he sends. Thus, in a referendum to be organized, more votes would be cast for the annexation of these regions to Russia. However, according to the information currently available, Putin is unable to meet the needs of the Russian citizens he has sent to Ukraine. It is quite normal for these citizens to be short of supplies when even the Russian army has a huge shortage of weapons and ammunition. The workers sent to Ukraine by Putin have already started striking. Putin sent many Russian workers to Ukraine to rebuild the occupied territories. However, these workers have stopped working. Allegedly, the Russian government is not paying their salaries, so thousands of workers have decided to strike.